Dawn, late October 1944. The flooded lowlands of the Scheldt estuary are hidden under a thick, colourless fog. Water laps quietly against broken dikes. Telephone poles stand like bare masts, stretching into a white wall where the road disappears. Somewhere beyond that curtain, German rifles and machine guns cover every approach, guarding the last routes to the vital deep water ports. On a narrow strip of raised ground, two Canadian figures lie motionless in the wet grass and mud. One studies the void through a battered number 32 scope. The other scans with field glasses, tracking sounds more than shapes. A distant clank of metal, a muffled order in German, the brief orange blink of a muzzle flash lost almost instantly in the mist. The German sniper believes the fog has made him untouchable, a hidden hunter over a drowned landscape. The Canadian sharpshooters see something else, faint silhouettes, sound patterns, the way the fog glows around disturbed branches and roof lines. A single flat crack echoes over the water. One more German position falls silent, and what looks like luck in the fog is in fact the result of years of training, doctrine and design choices that brought Canadian scout snipers to this moment. By the autumn of 1944, the Second World War in Western Europe had entered a new phase. The great summer battles were over. The breakout from Normandy, the liberation of much of France, the dash through Belgium, all had pushed German forces back towards their own borders. But speed had created a new problem. The Allies were running on a long, thin supply line that still depended on beaches and distant ports. To keep advancing, they needed a deep water harbour much closer to the front. That made the Scheldt estuary in the Netherlands suddenly critical. The port of Antwerp had been captured largely intact by British forces in early September. But as long as German units controlled the approaches along the Scheldt, no large ship could reach it. The job of clearing those approaches, low dikes, flooded polders, villages clinging to narrow strips of land, fell mainly to the 1st Canadian Army. It was unlike almost anything they had faced before. The ground was flat, saturated, and often deliberately flooded by German engineers. Trenches and weapon pits became muddy islands. Roads and embankments turned into narrow causeways under observation from multiple directions. In early mornings and late afternoons, the entire landscape could vanish under a blanket of fog rolling in from the cold North Sea. Here, visibility was not merely reduced. It was unstable. A tree line might be visible 1 minute and gone the next. A farmhouse could appear as a dark shape at 200 meters, then melt back into grey. Artillery observers, tank commanders and machine gun crews all discovered that their usual range of vision was shortened, unpredictable, and deceptive. The Germans tried to turn this to their advantage. They positioned snipers and machine guns to watch the causeways and crossings, using church towers, attics and reinforced bunkers where they could still command what little view remained. Their aim was simple: bleed any Canadian advance, one man at a time, on ground that left few options for manoeuvre. But the Canadians had spent years developing a different answer to difficult visibility. Within their infantry battalions, specialist scout and sniper platoons had been trained not just to shoot, but to observe, to stalk, and to operate in terrain where most soldiers could barely see the next field. What for many was a dangerous handicap, mist, drizzle, smoke, low cloud, could become, in the right hands, a kind of cover. The fog over the Scheldt was not an accident of weather. For Canadian sharpshooters, it was becoming a deliberate tool, shaped by training that had begun long before they reached these flooded Dutch fields. Canadian infantry battalions did not arrive in northwest Europe with snipers as an afterthought. Before they ever saw the Scheldt, they had been rebuilding a capability that had first appeared in the trenches of the First World War. Small numbers of carefully selected riflemen, trained to hit with precision and disappear just as precisely. By the time of Normandy and the autumn campaigns of 1944, many Canadian units maintained dedicated scout and sniper platoons, attached directly to the battalion. Selection was deliberate. Candidates were usually steady men, proven shots, comfortable working in pairs or small groups well forward of the main line. They needed sharp eyesight, patience, and the ability to remain motionless for hours in uncomfortable positions. A good trigger finger was not enough. Commanders wanted hunters, not just marksmen. Their training reflected that. On ranges in Britain and in the countryside used for field exercises, Canadian snipers learned to judge distance under varying light, to read mirage and wind, and to compensate for elevation and angle. Just as importantly, they learned fieldcraft, how to crawl using dead ground, how to use vegetation without creating obvious human shapes, and how to construct hides that blended into hedgerows, farm roofs, or riverbanks. Their equipment was also different. From the standard Lee Enfield No. 4 rifle, armourers selected the most accurate examples and converted them into sniper rifles by adding a side-mounted scope, cheekpiece, and tuned trigger. These No. 4 T rifles fired the familiar .303 cartridge, but with a combination of reliability and accuracy that made them effective in the damp, muddy, and often freezing conditions of northwest Europe. The wooden stock held up well in bad weather, and the robust action tolerated dirt and moisture that might have stopped a more delicate design. Optics mattered in fog and low light. The No. 32 scope was not exotic by later standards, but it offered a clear, stable image and held its zero when knocked or carried for long periods. For Canadian sharpshooters, this meant confidence that if they could glimpse a target, even as a faint shape through mist, the rifle would send a round exactly where they intended. Photographs from the period, such as the well-known image of Sergeant Harold Marshall of the Calgary Highlanders, show the typical appearance: a calm-faced soldier with a scoped rifle, camouflaged smock or battle dress, and the relaxed posture of someone used to moving and waiting in difficult ground. That image, taken in the ruins of European streets, also speaks to the role Canadian snipers played beyond open fields. They were as at home in rubble and alleys as they were in hedgerows and canal banks. By the time the Canadian Army entered the Scheldt, these scout sniper teams had already worked their trade in Normandy, through the bocage, around fortified villages, and along river crossings. They had learned how weather and terrain could betray careless movement, and how the same conditions could conceal a patient stalk. In places where fog and smoke reduced the world to a narrow, shifting corridor of visibility, these teams were ready to turn that limitation into a weapon. For Canadian sharpshooters, fog was not merely something to endure. It was a medium they learned to inhabit. On many mornings in 1944 and 1945, sniper pairs left their company areas before first light. They moved quietly, often without speaking, along ditches, drainage canals, and the reverse slopes of dikes. The world around them was reduced to shades of grey and the faint outlines of trees, barns, and telegraph poles. They worked in pairs for a reason. One man carried the scoped rifle, focused on the narrow field of view inside his optic. The other scanned wider, using binoculars or the naked eye to catch movement the scope might miss. The spotter listened constantly, boots scraping on wood, the metallic click of a bolt, the low murmur of men who believed they were out of earshot. In fog, sound carried strangely, sometimes seeming closer or farther than it really was. Learning to interpret those distortions became a skill as valuable as marksmanship. Fog offered camouflage, but it also punished carelessness. A careless silhouette on the skyline, a sudden movement against a pale background, or the sharp outline of a helmet could stand out even more in low visibility. Canadian snipers learned to move in short, controlled bursts, freezing when the mist thinned, and advancing again when it thickened. They used the edges of hedges, the dark lines of dikes, and the broken contours of ruined farm buildings to break their shape into fragments. Their mission was rarely just to kill isolated targets. They watched crossing points, suspected headquarters, artillery observation posts, and likely machine gun nests. A single well-placed shot could remove a German observer who was directing fire onto a Canadian company. Another could silence a machine gun crew preparing to enfilade a dike road. In fog, these positions might reveal themselves only by a briefly opened door, a momentary flash, or a figure leaning a little too far from cover. The emotional load was significant. Hours of stillness in cold, wet clothing, fingers numbed despite gloves, eyes straining to pick out meaning from shifting grey. The knowledge that a mistake could bring a burst of fire from a German rifle or machine gun at close range. Yet many snipers described their work in practical terms, a job that, if done correctly, reduced casualties among their own infantry and made enemy movements costly. Fog changed the usual balance between attacker and defender. Instead of advancing blindly into prepared fields of fire, Canadian infantry could rely on these small teams to feel ahead, probing with observation and occasional shots. identifying where Germans had placed their trust in concealment. For the German snipers and sentries who believed mist made them safe, the first sign that this was no longer true was often a sudden crack and a fall into the wet earth. To understand why German marksmen so often found themselves at a disadvantage in these conditions, we need to look beyond human skill alone and examine the tools, the environment, and the assumptions on both sides. Technically, German and Canadian snipers entered northwest Europe with broadly comparable tools. In the fog, small differences began to matter a great deal. German sharpshooters often used scoped versions of the Carabiner 98K. It was a strong, accurate rifle, firing a powerful 7.92 x 57mm cartridge. In open terrain, with clear lines of sight, German snipers had demonstrated repeatedly, on the Eastern Front and elsewhere, that they could dominate large stretches of ground. Their optics, mounted over the receiver, provided good magnification and a familiar sight picture. Canadian sniper rifles were more modest in appearance. The Lee Enfield No. 4 T did not advertise itself. It was, at heart, the same rugged .303 rifle carried by the ordinary infantryman, but carefully selected and tuned. The side-mounted No. 32 telescope looked almost bulky, yet it was built to withstand rough handling and foul weather. In damp, foggy climates, the combination of reliable action, stable zero, and clear glass gave Canadian sharpshooters a crucial advantage. Trust. A sniper who doubted his rifle or his scope in poor visibility might hesitate. A sniper who trusted them could focus entirely on the target. Fog changed how light worked on the battlefield. Instead of sharp contrasts, there were softened outlines and halos where moisture in the air scattered brightness. Canadians learned to use this to their advantage. Against a lighter background, a pale sky, open water, or mist over a field, even a slight movement could produce a shifting shape. A darker smudge where no smudge should be. Through a well-zeroed 4-pime scope, that smudge became just enough detail. The line of a helmet rim, the angle of a rifle barrel protruding from a window, the slight darkening where a firing slit in a bunker broke the monotony of concrete. Camouflage worked differently in these conditions too. German uniforms and helmet covers were well designed for woods and fields. But in heavy fog, large blocks of dark tone could stand out if they broke the subtle gradients of grey. Canadian snipers, often draped in smocks, netting and local foliage, worked to match not only colour but texture, the irregularity of hedges, the tangled reeds along canals, the broken tiles of a shattered roof. From a distance they aimed to appear as nothing at all, or as just another patch of the landscape. On the German side, assumptions carried over from clearer theatres of war. Sniper doctrine stressed good fields of fire, elevated positions, and carefully chosen hides with commanding views. Church towers, top-floor windows, and tree platforms had served well when visibility was stable. In the mist of the Scheldt and the cold, clinging vapour of forest battles, these same positions could betray them. A muzzle flash at height was easier to isolate. A figure outlined against a lighter patch of sky became more visible, not less. Reports from the period show that Allied snipers, including Canadians, were increasingly feared, and that enemy movement in many sectors shifted to night or heavy cover to avoid their fire. The feeling among German infantry in these fog-bound fields was not just that they were being opposed by good marksmen, but that they were being watched by men who seemed able to see through conditions that should have provided safety. In reality, nothing supernatural was involved. It was the careful marriage of robust equipment, patient fieldcraft, and a willingness to work inside the limits of visibility rather than against them. Where some saw only a blank wall of grey, Canadian sharpshooters saw layers, gradients, and clues. All of these elements, training, weapons, environment, and enemy assumptions, would converge in specific battles where the fog seemed almost to take sides, and where German snipers discovered that the role of hunter could be reversed in a matter of hours. For a week in late October 1944, the fog over the Scheldt felt almost permanent. Each morning, the same pattern repeated itself along the dikes and narrow roads leading towards the estuary. Canadian infantry companies formed up in the half-light, boots already wet before they left their start lines. Ahead of them, the land narrowed into causeways, raised strips of earth and stone, flanked by flooded polder fields that could swallow a man who stepped too far from the track. German units had dug in to make every metre costly. They occupied farmhouses hardened into strongpoints, bunkers cut into the sides of dikes, and attic firing points that watched over the approaches. Among them were experienced snipers, many of whom had previously served on other fronts. They placed themselves where doctrine and experience told them to be, overlooking likely crossing points, with fields of fire down the roads and along the embankments. On paper, it was an ideal setup for the defender. In the fog, that certainty began to crumble. When the first light filtered through the mist, Canadian scout sniper pairs were already out in front, moving low along drainage ditches and behind the shoulders of the dikes. They advanced ahead of the main infantry, often unseen even by their own side. They stopped whenever the fog thinned and resumed when it thickened again, using the rhythm of the weather as a kind of clock. The first German shots of the day often came suddenly. A Canadian section stepped onto an exposed stretch of dike. A figure appeared briefly in an attic window. A crack, sometimes muffled by the mist, and a man fell. Instinct told survivors to get down, to hug the narrow cover of the road itself or slide part-way down the embankment. In the early days of the campaign, these ambushes exacted a toll, but now, almost immediately, another sound followed. Somewhere out in the grey, a single, deliberate shot replied. Not a blind burst of rifle fire, but one controlled round. A German firing slit darkened, then went still. Minutes later, another attempt from a different house or bunker ended the same way. Canadian infantry began to notice that the invisible enemy ahead of them was being hunted by someone even less visible. Over that week, patterns emerged. Every time German snipers used the upper windows of certain buildings, Canadian sharpshooters logged the angles, ranges, and likely hides. Each muzzle flash became data. Each day's fog taught them which silhouettes betrayed a firing position. The sharp line of a rifle barrel, the unnatural rectangle of an opened shutter, the repeated disturbance of a particular patch of hedge. By using the fog to move into oblique positions, Canadian sniper pairs turned the German advantages against them. A church tower that once dominated the causeway became a liability when the faint outline of its firing slits stood out like a dark tooth against the pale morning sky. A farmhouse attic that seemed safe now drew the attention of a pair lying prone in a flooded ditch 40 or 50 meters off the main road. German sharpshooters reacted as the days passed. Some shifted to lower positions, firing from ground-floor loopholes instead of obvious vantage points. Others changed hides more frequently, hoping to stay unpredictable. But every move in the mist created new sounds, new outlines, new chances for a patient Canadian observer to catch the slight change in the fog's texture that meant a man had leaned too far. The effect on the ground was gradual but real. Canadian platoon commanders reported fewer sudden, unexplained casualties from unseen marksmen. When snipers did strike, there was now a greater chance that a sharp-eyed pair ahead of the line would answer. The sense of advancing into an entirely unseen killing field began, slowly, to shift into something else. The knowledge that their own unseen riflemen were working in that same grey space. Yet for the German snipers, the true shock did not come from statistics or reports. It came on the days when they discovered, in the space of a single fog-bound morning, that the man who believed he was hunting was already under someone else's sights. Dawn arrived without colour. A thick, cold fog rolled in from the Scheldt estuary, swallowing the landscape until even the nearest tree line was only a smudged silhouette. The sun was somewhere above the horizon, but its light never broke through. Only a pale, diffused glow hung over the flooded ground. For German snipers watching the causeways, this was familiar terrain. They had prepared firing points the night before. An attic window overlooking a bend in the dike, a low loophole cut into a barn wall, a concealed nest behind a collapsed haystack. In clear weather, these positions would have dominated the road. In fog, they believed the advantage was even greater. If the Canadians could not see them, then the first shot of the day would be theirs. Shortly after first light, a Canadian platoon moved cautiously along the dike. They advanced in short bounds, stopping every few meters to scan the indistinct shapes ahead. Somewhere beyond the fog, a German marksman shifted his weight, steadied his rifle, and fired. The shot cracked sharply through the damp air. A man fell. The rest flattened themselves against the embankment, feeling the familiar dread of being pinned by someone they could not locate. Then, only a moment later, a second sound cut through the fog. A single, measured Canadian reply. It came from somewhere off the causeway. Slightly angled, impossible to pinpoint. The German firing point in the attic window went silent. The platoon waited. No follow-up shots came. The fog closed again over the still house. Farther along the dike, 2 Canadian sharpshooters lay nearly submerged in a drainage ditch, rifles resting on mud-soaked packs. They had been in place for almost an hour, moving centimetre by centimetre into their hide before the fog settled thick enough to mask them completely. They had not seen the German sniper clearly. Only the faint, unnatural square of an open shutter, and the slight disturbance of fog when the rifle barrel shifted. To them, that was enough. As the platoon advanced again, another German sniper opened fire from a barn door near an irrigation canal. This time, the shot produced only a spark of dust on the dike. He fired again, adjusting, but in doing so, he exposed himself for a fraction longer. A Canadian observer, 30 metres off the road, caught the faint change in contrast. A darker blur against the pale background. He murmured a range. The shooter exhaled, tightened the sling, and fired once. The barn fell silent. By mid-morning, German positions that had seemed secure were becoming traps. The fog, once their shield, now betrayed them. Inside the mist, sound behaved strangely. A footstep on wood could travel farther than expected. A bolt sliding forward could echo across the water. Every adjustment of position, meant to create unpredictability, created new clues for Canadian ears. One German sniper tried to shift from his loft into a lower loophole. As he descended the ladder, the faint scrape of boot on wood carried across the marsh. 200 metres away, a Canadian pair froze, listening. When the muzzle of the rifle appeared at the lower firing slit, the sniper believed he was hidden. The Canadians had already mapped the angle. The shot that struck him came from a place he had never considered vulnerable. By noon, the fog thickened again, turning the world into a narrow corridor of vision no wider than a lane. In this small, shifting space, dominance belonged not to the man who fired first, but to the one who understood how fog carved the terrain differently with each minute. Canadian sharpshooters began identifying positions by patterns rather than clear images. Repeated flashes from a certain height, the faint glow of light behind a cracked door, the uneven outline of branches where someone had cut a firing lane. German marksmen, who expected long duels or clear fields, found themselves targeted within seconds of revealing their presence. A German sniper in a reinforced farmhouse made one last attempt to restore control. He fired from a low loophole, then quickly withdrew deeper inside the room. He waited for the Canadian response, expecting blind return fire. None came. For several minutes, all was quiet. Then, from somewhere in the marsh to his left, another single round snapped through the fog, striking the loophole's edge. The Canadian had taken time to triangulate the angle, closing distance silently while the German remained frozen in expectation of fire from the road. The German sniper realized that he was not facing a random shot from infantry under pressure. Someone had studied his position, moved unseen through water and reeds, and placed a rifle on him with intention and clarity inside a world where he himself could barely identify shapes. The hunter had become the hunted. By late afternoon, German infantry in the sector began pulling back from exposed positions. The fog remained unchanged, thick, cold, unmoving, but the psychological landscape had shifted entirely. Places once considered safe in low visibility now felt perilous. Tall buildings became liabilities. Attic windows became giveaways. Even silence became suspicious. Canadian sharpshooters remained in their hides as the light faded, waiting for the final movements before dusk. Their rifles stayed steady. Their visibility remained narrow but purposeful. In the spaces between reeds, roofs, and ruined interiors, they could still read what the fog revealed to those who knew how to look. The day ended not with a dramatic assault, but with a quiet imbalance, one side adapting to the fog, the other still expecting it to behave like cover. In the days that followed, commanders across the Canadian front began to notice a pattern in their reports. Casualties from German sniper fire, once a steady and demoralizing feature of every advance along a dike, hedgerow, or canal, were dropping. Not disappearing, but shifting. Instead of losing men before they could identify a firing point, platoons were now advancing under the quiet assurance that somewhere ahead, or off to the flank, Their own sharpshooters were already shaping the battlefield inside the fog. This was not a sudden transformation, but a cumulative effect. Canadian battalions recorded instances where traditional German strongpoints lost their value simply because their visibility betrayed them. An attic window that commanded a wide field of fire on a clear day became a perfect silhouette when the fog brightened behind it. A firing slit in a barn that once blended into shadows became an oddly rigid shape against diffused grey light. Each time a German marksman used such a position, Canadian observers added that detail to a mental map that became sharper with each engagement. The tactical impact rippled outward. Machine gun teams reported fewer sudden flanking shots from concealed German riflemen. Patrols sent ahead at dawn encountered less accurate harassment fire, suggesting that German snipers were either relocating more cautiously or avoiding early engagements entirely. When Canadian companies pushed along causeways or into flooded hamlets, they did so with growing confidence, not recklessness, but the steady assurance that unknown threats could be answered by known specialists. This shift forced German infantry to adapt. Units that once relied on sniper fire to slow Canadian movements began altering their routines. Movement between positions increased, but constant relocation created new openings for detection. Some German snipers abandoned elevated hides altogether, preferring ground-level loopholes or deep interior rooms, choices that limited their visibility and restricted their fields of fire. Others reduced activity during fog-heavy mornings, waiting for clearer conditions that rarely came. The psychological burden was felt immediately. Infantry companies described a creeping sense that the mist concealed dangers for the defenders, not just the attackers. Soldiers hesitated to peer from windows or over parapets, unsure whether a distant observer had already marked their outline. Communication between positions grew more cautious. Even routine work, repairing sandbags, adjusting camouflage, checking ammunition, was done with an awareness that the fog no longer guaranteed anonymity. Canadian commanders recognized the value of this shift. They began assigning sniper pairs not only to counter-sniper duties, but to deliberate shaping tasks. These teams were placed forward before major attacks, removing key observers, reducing early warning, and silently disrupting German coordination. Every precise shot saved effort elsewhere. An artillery barrage that did not have to be called in blind, an infantry platoon that could advance without taking the first fatal round, a machine gun team that could position itself without fear of exposure. Numbers told only part of the story. Canadian sniper teams were small, often fewer than a dozen trained specialists per battalion, yet their actions influenced engagements far larger than their size. In sectors where they operated effectively, the pace of advance improved. Patrols reached objectives more reliably, and German counterattacks arrived with less coordination. For the Canadians trudging along flooded roads and wind-lashed embankments, this meant fewer sudden losses, fewer moments of helplessness under unseen fire, and a growing sense that the fog, once a universal hazard, had shifted subtly in their favor. And for the German units holding those same positions, the fog became something else entirely, an element they no longer controlled, one they no longer understood, and one that now seemed to reveal them before they could see anything at all. For German infantry who survived the Scheldt fighting, the memory of those fog-bound days lingered long after the front moved east. They had entered the campaign believing, with some justification, that poor visibility favored the defender. Fog concealed movement. Fog hid firing positions. Fog slowed attackers who relied on reconnaissance and artillery spotting. In earlier battles, in forests, cities and open fields, mist had often worked in their favor. In the Scheldt, it began working against them. The first shock was the speed with which Canadian sharpshooters adapted. German diaries, post-war interviews and unit records describe a growing unease. The sense that every elevated position became dangerous the moment the fog settled. Sentries reported being struck without ever seeing who fired. Snipers, accustomed to commanding the morning hours, found themselves neutralized by opponents they could not locate, even at short range. The fog did not lift to reveal Canadian marksmen. It only revealed the consequences of their presence. This psychological erosion spread through German units in subtle ways. Movement became cautious, even hesitant. Soldiers avoided standing near windows, even briefly. Patrols set out later in the day or under heavier escort. Routine observation, checking the road, monitoring a suspected crossing, became a source of tension, as any momentary exposure might draw an unseen shot. A breakdown in trust followed. Not just trust in the terrain, but trust in the idea that concealment equaled safety. Canadian sharpshooters, by contrast, operated with growing confidence. Their methods, slow crawls, controlled breathing, coordinated observation, turned fog into an ally rather than a barrier. For them, low visibility removed distractions. It narrowed the world to shapes, tones, and subtle markers. A small movement at the wrong time, a darkened slit where a rifle barrel interrupted the smooth gradient of mist, the faintest ripple of fog inside a doorway that should have remained still. These small differences, almost invisible to most soldiers, became decisive. As the campaign continued into northern Belgium and the Netherlands, Canadian units refined their use of sniper pairs during low visibility. They pushed them ahead during river crossings, placed them along flanks to prevent infiltration, and integrated their reports into company-level planning. Every engagement proved the same lesson. A well-trained observer with a reliable rifle could shape the tempo of a battlefield far beyond his own position. The long-term doctrinal impact grew quietly but clearly. Canadian infantry schools after the war preserved many lessons from Northwest Europe, particularly the importance of fieldcraft, stealth, and understanding terrain under adverse weather. The ethos of patient observation, which had defined their sniper sections, would carry into later decades and contribute to the reputation Canadian marksmen earned in conflicts far removed from the Scheldt's flooded fields. Within German accounts, a different kind of legacy formed. Veterans recalled the fear of being hunted in mist, of hearing a single rifle shot that came from nowhere, of watching an elevated vantage point become a fatal mistake, the memory of losing trusted positions. Church towers, attics, ridgeline hides, marked a reversal of expectations that left many feeling exposed in conditions they had once considered advantageous. Nothing mystical happened in those engagements. No superhuman vision, no extraordinary technology, only discipline, patience, training, and the willingness to let fog, the great equalizer of sight, become a tool instead of a threat. The mental divide between the two armies grew sharper as the campaign went on, one side adapting to the fog with quiet precision, the other struggling against an environment that no longer behaved in predictable ways. These moments would not decide the war alone, but they reshaped countless encounters across the lowlands, replacing the feeling of helplessness among advancing Canadians with a quiet confidence, and replacing German certainty with doubt and strain. And in any battlefield, that exchange, confidence for fear, is as consequential as any map movement or tactical withdrawal. Fog hides many things, but it also reveals truths that clear skies never show. In the low grey mornings of the Scheldt and the cold forests that followed, Canadian sharpshooters discovered that war is often decided not by those who see farthest, but by those who learn to see best when vision is taken away. In that narrow world, where shapes wavered, distances shrank, and sound replaced sight, they learned to read the land in fragments and clues. What appeared empty to most soldiers was, to them, a layered landscape of opportunities and warnings. The Germans, long accustomed to dominating early hours with well-placed riflemen, found themselves confronting an opponent whose skills matched the weather. Their traditional advantages dissolved. Elevated hides betrayed them. Familiar windows became silhouettes. Movements once protected by morning mist now drew immediate, precise fire. The fog, which for years had served as a loyal ally, no longer behaved as expected. For the Canadians, the transformation was not dramatic. It came quietly, through discipline, reliability of equipment, and patience honed in countless exercises. Each careful shot, each hour spent motionless in the cold, restored a sense of control to advancing infantry who had grown used to sudden, unseen losses. Their work rarely appeared on maps or in grand strategic statements, yet it shaped every platoon that moved forward under their protection. The deeper meaning of those fog-bound engagements survives beyond tactics. They remind us that warfare is not only a contest of strength, but of perception, that even in the most uncertain conditions, clarity belongs to those who accept the limits of their environment and master them, and that courage can be quiet, found in the stillness of a ditch, the steady breath behind a scope, the willingness to wait for the exact moment when an indistinct shape becomes a certain threat. In the end, the fog over the Scheldt did not lift to reveal heroes or villains. It revealed the enduring truth that victory often belongs to those who understand the unseen and who trust their discipline enough to act within it.